Thank you for everybody to be connected today. We will save today Mike Featherstone from the Goldsmiths University University of London, and we will talk on the question of the Olympic Games in Tokyo and the city image of Tokyo 2020. Thank you, and for this new year of the webinar of the Fondation France-Japon of EHESS, we will have this for the rest of the year only one session in 1 month after the session of Mike Featherstone, and we will have a large conference at the end of the year, the 30th of November and the 7th of December in Paris, and in online evidently. So you will be welcome, and you will have the possibility to see the program in the website of the Fondation France-Japon and the OGGC Olympic Games and Global City Hypothesis Carnet. So I will now let the talk to Mike Featherstone. Thank you to be here today, and thank you to accept to have this presentation. We will have the possibility. You will have the possibility to ask a question to Mike Featherstone by the chat, or you will have the possibility after the presentation to have the mic to tell your question in direct. So thank you, Mike, and I give you the floor now.
Thank you very much. I am really pleased to be here virtually. I should just say a few words about myself. I'm professor of sociology in Goldsmiths University of London, and I'm editor of the journal Theory, Culture and Society, and another journal, Body and Society. I published widely in a lot of different areas, consumer culture, globalization, global culture, the body, and I got interested in the Olympics with my partner Tomoko Tamari. We held a colloquium here in Goldsmiths and also one in the University of Tokyo, and we both travel to Japan a number of times a year and work with people there. So the whole idea of the Tokyo Olympics has been coming for a long time. Next slide, please. Next. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so, but of course, it's been coming a long time, but then it didn't take place in 2020. But of course, there were lots of images, lots of simulations, lots of information, and the city was becoming refurbished for the event, not in the same way as the 1964 Olympics, which was a major program of modernization for the city of Tokyo. But everybody was becoming ready for the global TV audience. Next, please. Next. Yeah. But one thing that stands out, that Tokyo Olympics may well have been a failure. It was protracted, the lead up, and the Deputy Prime Minister Taro Aso said in March 2020 it was just he had a sort of 40-year theory. Something terrible happens every 40 years in Japan, and the Olympics is coming into that cycle, and it's cursed. It won't happen. And our colleague and friend, Professor Shunya Yoshimi, University of Tokyo, remarked in a number of colloquia that the Olympics had really failed because in comparison with the 1964 Olympics, it was very pale comparison. It was a wonderful Olympics in 64 with a big modernization of the city, which largely worked, whereas the 2020 just didn't have the same definition and energy. So then we have the actual games postponed 1 year because of COVID, and we still have controversies, many controversies. We have very limited spectatorship, and a lot of gaffes and mishaps occurred in the presentation, although I gather the TV audience was as old as I was and many people. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the this is not Tintin's father. This is a sort of image of Aso. Next, please. This is the reaction against the Olympics. People didn't want it to happen. Next, please. So we look at the Olympic Games. Well, it's a useful device. It's an event itself. One can focus on the event, the spectacle, but it's also something in a city, and it's usually in a global city. So it's a very useful device that cuts open the city. We know, of course, it's a big show. It's something which represents the city on the global stage. Tokyo's in the top reference group of global cities, and it can represent itself through the Olympics, and it's allegedly a stimulus to the economy, but the outcomes and the actual budget and financing are usually subject to a lot of creative accounting. So the legacy is always problematic. But focusing on the city, the Olympics makes us aware of parts of the city that often remain hidden. And I want to think of the infrastructures of the city, not just the surface of the city. It makes us think about how a city works, the life processes that keep a city going. But these are also image dependent. We have city functionaries, marketeers, culture intermediaries, specialists, academics, and the general public who are constantly encountering and refurbishing the image making process. And the Olympic Games also makes us think about the methodologies and theories these specialists and intermediaries use, and also the ones we should use to look at the city. So it's a useful event. Next, please. Next, yeah. So I just say a little bit briefly about how I became interested in putting these two together. I worked on the Olympics with Tomoko Tamari here in Goldsmiths. We had a colloquium looking at London, Rio, and Tokyo, and also one in Tokyo. But at the time, I was also looking at cityscapes and city image. I'd worked for a long time with a friend, David Frisby, who was a translator of Georg Simmel and wrote a lot on modernity. So I was starting to think the city and the Olympic city together through some of Simmel and Frisby. Next, please. This is David's book, Cityscapes of Modernity. Next, please. And I wrote a paper in a collection sort of honouring David, who died a few years ago, on urban aestheticization processes, cityscape, landscape, and image. Next, please. Yeah, so I was mentioning that I worked with David Frisby, who died a few years ago, and wrote a paper for his celebratory volume looking at Simmel on the city and landscape, and catching up with some essays of Simmel I'd not really studied enough. But I'd worked a long time on Georg Simmel's work, and with David. We edited a volume back in 1992 or 3 on Simmel on culture, which was a set of essays from Simmel, translated into English. And in the journal Theory, Culture and Society, we had a number of special issues and sections on Georg Simmel. The red cover one is the first one. We tried to use some of the lettering there from Jugend, an Art Nouveau magazine Simmel wrote for in the 1890s. So Simmel, Frisby were very much in my mind, and the city and the questions of landscape, when I started to think about the Olympic city. Next slide, please. So the 3 terms that came out to me were cityscape, landscape, and streetscape. Of course, Simmel didn't use streetscape, but also city image, again, a term. I think he used something near that in terms of built. So I wanted to start thinking the city, but also to go a little bit deeper, to think about the city as a three-dimensional space, not just vertically or superficially the city on the map, but some people talk about the vertical city, the skyscrapers, but think about it in terms of volume. And my colleague here in Goldsmiths, Eyal Weitzman, has worked on Palestine, Israeli frontier areas using notions of volume, where you look at the below ground, but you look in the air as well. You look in a three-dimensional way, as also does my journal colleague, Stuart Eldon. So look at the built structures. Okay, that's normal with the city. The infrastructures, yeah, but also infostructures, the information structures above the city. So the rhythms of city, Lefebvre and many people pointed to the city rhythms, the rhythms of people and things over time. But the city then is a multiple thing. It's not one, it's not integrated, all the bits don't necessarily fit together. So we also need to inquire into the methodological and theoretical frameworks which will help us to model these processes, especially digital resources. And digital simulations of the city have advanced tremendously fast in recent years. So Simmel, Georg Simmel, wrote a very important essay, How is Society Possible? But we should also say, how is a city possible? Next, please. So this amounts to a shift in our ways of seeing. From the city we see and imagine, the city beneath us as we stand on a hill, the landscape, the city in the landscape, or the city from the top of a high building, the cityscape. So we shift from this notion, the common views of the city, to the city that sees us. The city is now looking at us, the city that senses us, the city studied with masses of sensory devices to record our movements, the city that tracks us. It doesn't just see us, it tracks us. When you have a phone, you're being tracked all the time. The city that records us and the various things we cohabit with, the transport systems. The city that digests this information, that aggregates it, puddles it together into sets. The city that visualizes the information, that finds ways to put all this masses of data, of algorithmic derived computer data into visual forms for people to act on very quickly. So it will become operationalized. And why? Because it's to govern us. The city will govern us, or the people who operate and digest this information will govern us. So another form of governance has really arisen on the city through building on the statistical amassing of data. But now this is another level. Next, please. So when we first think of a city, often we think of the city image. You know, is there a city, an image that stands for the city as a whole, an iconic image? Well, the city I'm addressing at the moment, and looking to you, Paris, the Eiffel Tower, would be an archetype of a city image standing for the city. Tokyo also had a tower, and there's a movie, Always, about the building of the Tokyo Tower, the people who live in its shadow, and it's set in the 1950s, sort of post-war Tokyo nostalgia movie, but quite interesting, which came out in 2005. But the Tokyo Tower doesn't stand for Tokyo in the way that the Eiffel Tower stands for Paris. Next slide, please. So first of all, I like to think about city image, but also city in the landscape. Next, please. We rarely notice the landscape setting when we're in the city, but there are exceptions. Rio de Janeiro is the exemplary case. It's an amazing natural setting. Could you please just jump to the next slide and back? Anyone who sees this image is clearly knocked out by the beauty, the sublime setting. Athens is another example. The Acropolis dominates the city. The landscape is in the city and becomes seen as part of the city. Of course, in Tokyo, Mount Fuji featured very strongly in 19th century woodcuts, the ukiyo-e woodcuts, and is somehow seen within the Tokyo cityscape. It is sort of brought forward. Less visible today, of course, because of pollution, and you only see it once in a while. But when it comes out, boom, it hits you in the face. So Mount Fuji, of course, is perhaps the most popular image standing for Japan, not just Tokyo, and was adopted by many Western media sources for the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. Next, please. Next. These are a series by Hiroshi Gei of views of Mount Fuji from Edo, which was the former name, of course, as you know, for Tokyo. You know, what always strikes you there is how big it is in relation to the city. It's sort of quite dominant. Next, please. This is another view from the center of Tokyo. Yeah. Next, please. These were in the 1850s, some sort of 12 years before the Meiji Restoration and the opening up of Japan. So it was still the old shogunate. Again, a dramatic, beautiful woodcut. Yeah. Next, please. This is to show that you can still, this is one I took actually from northern Tokyo near where I live when I'm in Tokyo. And it just happened coming out of the supermarket, things had cleared and it was sunset and there was Mount Fuji. And it's a sort of quasi-industrial sublime, you might want to call it, with the pylons and the industry there. Next, please. There's just another version. Next, please. So, of course, Mount Fuji, as we said, stands for Japan, and in the Olympic build-up to the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, it featured, and there's a lot of beautiful aestheticized views from the other side. This is not from the Tokyo side. You know, obviously there's many ways to see the mountain, and these are quite interesting. And of course, this was used in package. There was a lot of. I looked at some of the adverts on the internet. This was £8,000, $10,000, 10,000 euros approximately for 1 week. You know, 7-day package. Looking at the Olympics, so quite hefty price. Next slide, please. Yeah, another slightly aestheticized one, maybe photoshopped a bit, viewing from the city, and you've got the Tokyo Tower there, lit up and in red, you know, prominent. Of course, it's a lot smaller than the Eiffel Tower, which it tries to mimic. But it is a landmark, and people in Japan and Tokyo especially are very fond of it. Next one, please. And here again, we've got I think, Good Housekeeping, which I read every week. Well, not really, but Good Housekeeping have got an interesting, I think it's Photoshop montage there. It's very hard to bring those things together. The Tokyo Tower looks massive here, and it's set in the grounds of a Shinto shrine in this view. And then you've got the very big Mount Fuji in the background. Next, please. And of course, the official Olympics wanted the tower. The tower is there, the Tokyo Tower in their iconography. Next, please. And of course, Paris, the new one for Paris 2024. We can't miss a good tower. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. So even when you're having a relaxing retreat, you need a window that looks out to the Eiffel Tower. It's interesting to know that Guy de Maupassant in the 19th century, after the tower was built, not too long after, was very got annoyed in a way with the commonplace of the tower, this tower everywhere, and reputedly had lunch in the tower because this was the only place in Paris where you don't have to see the damn tower. But of course, we know the tower and the mass reproduction of it, those little models which school children buy and take home to their parents around the world, that it stands for Paris and represents the city around the world. There is the interesting question, is the Eiffel Tower ever seen in the landscape, like the Tokyo Tower can be seen in the landscape towards Mount Fuji? But this would be rarely the case except from a drone view. Interestingly enough, Jacques Cousteau said that when he was a child, he could look from the Eiffel Tower and see the Alps. On a clear day, of course, but I'm not sure this is possible today. But we can't scale the Alps into the Paris landscape except with a lot of photoshopping. Okay, next slide, please. Tokyo has a new tower. Many of you may not know this. It's called the Sky Tree, and it's 633 meters. It's massive. But it doesn't stand for Tokyo in the way the Tokyo Tower does. And it looks like in this picture we've got Mount Fuji trying to sneak into the background, sort of photobombing the Tokyo Sky Tree. Next slide, please. So landscape doesn't always feature strongly in the city. It only rarely. Rio de Janeiro is very unique, but what we do have is cityscapes, the buildingscapes of the city and the layout of the city, often on hills, which gives a certain definition to the images of the city. Georg Simmel wrote several essays on cities as works of art, an interesting notion. Florence was the exemplar with its beautiful natural setting and hills, and the relationship between the buildings and the natural landscape was perfect for him. He also talked about Venice and Rome too. But today, when we think of cityscapes, we usually think of high-rise, particularly Manhattan, with the dominant central buildings around Central Park and of course, the financial district in the south. But an ideal cityscape would be one in which the landscape had been completely tamed. The geomorphology, the original geology of the city, the shape of the rocks and the grounding of the city, this had become subdued and tamed and lost sight of. So swamps, as in the case of Tokyo, swamps were filled in, trees were felled, hills were flattened, we can add the question. I've been looking at the work of a French theorist, François Julien. Recently, we have a Theory, Culture and Society special issue coming out on China against ontology, looking at his work. And he has a book on living off the landscape and gives us a very interesting different notion of the landscape. He feels the Greek Western-derived notion is just too ocular-centric, and of course the Renaissance builds on that. And when he talks about the landscape in China, it's really sensing the landscape from within. He talks about going up a mountain and sitting inside a mountain hut, not looking out the window at the landscape, but just feeling and sensing the being in the mountains, how it feels through the other body senses than the eyes, which is a very interesting notion. Next, please. So when you think of the Tokyo cityscape, of course, many people still want to put in Mount Fuji because it's iconic and it adds something. Next, please. Next. But Tokyo has a very sort of Janus-faced city image in a way. It has another side to it than the beauty or attempted beautification process through Mount Fuji, the association of Mount Fuji and the ukiyo-e. It is very much what Rem Koolhaas called a generic city, a sort of faceless city with buildings. Not architecture. It has some architecture, but it's some. In this, it can be likened to the dark noir city, the Blade Runner city, popularized by Philip Dick, and the two movies built on his writings. And Tokyo itself has been characterized as a Blade Runner city, and of course other East Asian cities, including Hong Kong. But it's an interesting notion, the faceless city, or the city without image. Yeah, we can think of the city image, we can think of the Eiffel Tower, but the faceless city. And interesting, Zimmel talked about this in relation to Berlin in the 1890s. Berlin was rather disparagingly referred to as Chicago on the Spree. Spree being the river that runs through Berlin, and Chicago at that time had only recently grown from the 1870s to the 90s in about 20 years, incredibly rapidly, but didn't really have iconic or architecture, and clearly didn't have a history. So Berlin was seen as buildings, as a sort of faceless city. The place one quickly forgets, the city without a memory. It hasn't a memory. When you walk through it, it doesn't summon up things to you. And this is captured in the expressionist paintings by Ludwig Meidner, which David Frisby discusses in his book. And you might want to say this is a little bit similar to Auger's notion of no place spaces, or Gertrude Stein's famous remark early in the 20th century, there is no there. I think she was referring to Oakland, just near San Francisco. Next, please. So this is Rem Koolhaas, the famous architect, Delirious, New York, very interesting read, but has written quite a lot of books on architecture, teaching at Harvard. This is his modeling of a generic city. Next, please. This, of course, the Blade Runner movie, which most of you will have seen, maybe have seen the second one as well. Next, please. And this is an image from the movie. Next, please. And another image. You can see this sort of sci-fi, fantasy, definitely noir, this dark city with strange walkways and very tall buildings. Next, please. This again is an image simulated from the movie. Another one, you can get wallpaper for the kids' bedroom as well. Yeah, next, please. And Hong Kong was interestingly likened as a Blade Runner city, and you can see the density there because of the need to use every scrap of land in Hong Kong. Next, please. This is Tokyo, made to look Blade Runner. Next, please. And there is an artist, Liam Wong, a photographer, who tried to capture Tokyo in this vernacular, in this vein, neon dreamland. Tokyo After Dark is Blade Runner. Next, please. Another of her pictures. Photos, yeah. Next, please. And just a quick look at Bidner, just 2 or 3 pictures. Next, please. Yeah, this is Apocalyptic City, 1912. Next, please. Burning City. Next, please. And an apocalyptic landscape. So we can look at the cityscapes. We can look at city image. We can look at cityscapes. But of course, when we move around the city, we feel we're in the city more when we're in the street, when we're looking at the streetscapes. But of course, the streetscapes may not be as visual. It's certainly not as ocular-centered notion, the streetscape. And Zimmel wrote a very famous essay, The Metropolis and Mental Life in 1903, referring to the rapid crowding of the city, the changing images and onrushing impressions, the intensification of nervous stimuli, neurasthenia, the overload of shocks and sensations, which wouldn't cohere and give you a strong narrative. You got into another set before you could think about what the previous set was. So a lot of speed, intensity, new sensations, lack of stable forms to make sense of it. And this was taken up in the 1920s in some of the German movies, like Fritz Lang's Metropolis and Walter Ruttmann's Berlin Symphony of a Great City. So it's if you like, an anti-aesthetic. It's an anti, certainly beautiful. So you can see on the screen, and I talked through the various characteristics of the streetscape, but the main one being that it was anti the visual. It's sort of beneath the visual. It's not necessarily anti-visual, but there's so many other things going on around you, and your vision is impaired, yeah, because there's people walking in front of you, and you don't get a view. You don't get time to pause and look and register the aesthetic qualities. So it's immersion. It's effective, full of effective bodily sensations. It's non-representation. It's at best a sort of ugly beauty, not a sort of chocolate box beauty. Yeah. Next, please. So if you try and think of this in Tokyo, you can, of course, and this is something that's marketable and saleable, and was in the advertising for the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. And there's one place which is also an image of Tokyo, which is used a lot on news programs around the world. When they say Tokyo, they either put up some high buildings, or they put up Shibuya Crossing, which is a sort of fashionable young person sort of area with clubs and a lot of life, and you can walk around quite a lot of it. And so it's sort of got street life, Tokyo. It's the famous place near the station where you've got 4 or 5 crossings, zebra crossings, we call them, which sort of intersect, and there's always loads of people around. Yeah. Next, please. So this was the, I mentioned in the 1920s there were films made which, including Fritz Lang, but this is Walter Ruttmann's Berlin Symphony of a Great City, clearly surrealist attempt to capture the jumble of imagery of the lived city, yeah? The being in the street and feeling the city. Yeah. Next, please. So you can see this also resonates with the notion of urban adventures. You go to the city not just to climb to the top of the building, tallest building, and look over Tokyo, or if you're in New York, to look over Manhattan, and everywhere has got some place like that. Really, it's the opposite. You want to be in the lower levels of the city, even the city underground, maybe the back alleys, the hidden places, the city of adventure, excitement, and risk. The city on foot. This is a walkable city. And I've seen faces of people, Western tourists in parts of Tokyo like this, and they are very excited. Yeah, when they discover these little back alleys, and they don't have the language, they can't read the signs. Most of them can't read any kanji, Chinese sinograms, symbols. So they're walking through an unscripted part of the city, which has a lot of resonance. So this is the city image taken up in urban tourism, the new sensations, the dark places. This is the 24-hour city, something that came into England in the 1990s, I think, late 80s, 90s, with Tony Blair and the Labour government. We should be allowed to drink 24 hours. And then English people started doing that. So the nightlife, the city that doesn't sleep. This is the sort of mole's eye view of the city, yeah? Not the bird's eye, not the city from the plane or the drone or the tall building. This is the porous city of interstitial spaces and mixing. City which sort of leaks people into mixing together. Yeah. Next, please. So these are some Olympic publicity showing this. You can get your taekwondo package, but then on the evening you can go and have some Japanese food. But this is, I think it's teppanyaki. This, and this is not really Japanese. I mean, it's sort of post-war Japanese, American Japanese food. I think it's like hot grill food, which I think the Americans liked to have their steaks. So it's a sort of Japanese version of American food, but it's globally everywhere as Japanese food now. Anyway, next slide, please. Yeah, this is interesting. There is a company now called Urban Adventures, which offers Lonely Planet type tourism and tours. So you can find the hidden places. So when you tell your friends, oh, of course, we didn't just go to Tokyo Tower, we went round the back streets. Da 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 da. So yeah, next, please. And of course, Tokyo has more Michelin-starred restaurants than anywhere in the world, including Paris. And gastronomy, the food, is now featured as a saleable, marketable item. Yeah, next, please. So you can get a tour, yeah, with a guide after 5. Yeah, next, please. Yeah, drinks and neon lights. Yeah, next, please. So let's move on to infrastructures and infostructures. We all know infrastructures, but maybe not info. We'll come on to that shortly. Infrastructures. Well, how is a city possible? We said urban life depends upon its infrastructures, bringing the people in, the roads, the elevated highways, the railways. But then the invisible below ground, the metro, the tunnels, the sewers, the utilities, the gas, water, electricity. Few who walk through London have any idea that in the 19th century, a sewer system was constructed for the first time by Joseph Bazalgette and Associates, which was an impressive form of civil engineering. Okay, we can maybe move on, yeah. This is I just love these slides. It's not really to do with Tokyo, but it's impressive to see how they built the sewers in Victorian times. Next, please. And just the size of the sewers, you can have a party in the sewer, which they did when they opened it. 1865. And if you get a chance to come to London and see the main drainage pumping station, which is a wonderful heritage item, please try and do that in East London. It's well worth a visit. Next, please. Yeah, and these are the workers who built it. And you can see that arch construction with the wood and then the bricks on top of the wood. So a lot of physical labor and skill went into building these sewers, and they're almost big enough for a car. Well, there will be not quite a bus. Next, please. Of course, when we think of infrastructure today, we don't often think of the sewers, but we often see cabling, yeah? When things are opened up, it's the guys fixing the cables, digging up the pavements of the streets we see. Next, please. Yeah, next. Yeah, and of course, you can simulate these in computers and you can plan them. Next, please. So it's quite difficult to map the cabling under the ground. Somebody had a map of one bit once and then they lost it, and then somebody altered it, and so it's very hard to know what is there. But now, more recently, with ground penetrating radar, we can capture in real time using 3D tomography of the subsoil, which can go down about 4 meters with the Leica Pegasus system. But then there's another more advanced system using lasers, the LIDAR system, which can be from drones above the city, which can penetrate, it's hard to believe, 40 meters, yeah? So you can go 40 meters below the ground. So here we're getting the volume city, we're getting the air, the sky above, and we're getting the city on the ground, and then we're getting the subsoil and what is there beneath the ground. So increasingly, the technology to understand this is computer, and increasingly the system below ground is governed by computer in a form of smart infrastructures. Okay, next please. So this again is an example of the cabling and the analysis available through ground penetrating radar. Next, please. And you can have a system that you tow behind the van. Next, please. But the more advanced, as I said, is the LIDAR, the light detection and ranging system, sending massive number of pulses every second, scanning the ground, beneath the ground. Yeah, next please. And this is a version, US Capitol building. Yeah, next. Yeah, and you can then represent the subground cabling and infrastructure. Next, please. Yeah, and bring it back into the computer, compare it to existing maps, update, etc. Next, please. So LIDAR is an interesting technology, not just for the urban city authorities to understand where the infrastructure is, and for all the utility companies to repair and upgrade the infrastructure. It's there for modeling the city, and it's been used in that way, not just by corporations, the state, but by academics. And I think it's a very interesting way to think of the city when you can have a 3D volumetric model of the city, which you can look at from many angles and penetrate in. You can zoom in and zoom out, etc. Next, please. So this is you can get a system on your car. Next. Next, please. If you can't afford a car, you can get a backpack version. And every sociologist and urbanist should get one for Christmas, maybe. And next, please. And then you can come back and you can assemble these images from a sort of lines, and you can fill in and you can get the volumed 3D version. Next, please. Istanbul, of course. Yeah. Next, please. And of course, Manhattan, you can get the interactive 3D visualizations of cities. Next, please. Next, please. What is interesting is that you can use these for cities in the past. And Edo, I mentioned the shogunate before the Meiji emperor was brought back in the Meiji Restoration, 1868. There have been attempts within the University of Tokyo, historians and computer people, to work together to try and use old maps and to try and simulate a 3D version of the city. Yeah, next, please. Next, please. Yeah. So, yeah, we get increasingly smart, and we're going to come on to more smartification processes. Next, please. Yeah. We know there's a lot being written recently on smart cities, and not all of it good. It can become a surveillance model for the city, working against a sort of public sphere, open citizenship city, etc. And Bernard Stiegler, who died last year, talked about this machinization of the city taking place with automated functionalities, deploying digital urban technologies, and provided a sort of strong critique, as have many other people, of this tendency, which seems very hard to counter. Next, please. Let's look at smart cities. This is a sort of typical image of smart cities. We've got the nice looping representations of the radio waves between buildings. Next, please. And the traffic, of course. So people talked a few years ago, maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, about the media city. Scott McQuire had a book in our Theory, Culture and Society book series on this. The fact that media were becoming ubiquitous and screens were everywhere. City centres have lots of screens. So you think, oh yeah, we're looking at screens. And of course, in Tokyo, some people watch the Olympics on big screens, as they did London Olympics and Rio, whatever. But now it's not just us looking at screens. Screens are looking at us. So it's the city of sensors, the city sensing us. Surveillance cameras, motion cameras, infrared cameras, sound sensors. The city is studied with RFIDs, radio frequency information devices, which feed back information to data networks, often via Wi-Fi. The data is recorded and some of it actioned in real time. It's not just the internet and business networks. We have our phone and we can talk to people in the city using Wi-Fi networks. Everything we do in work, public life, urban infrastructures, travel, leisure, consumer choice and taste, all of this generates data, and that data now is harvested. You might have seen Zuboff's book, very critical analysis of the data platforms called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which looks at the US major top platforms and how they harvest our data and behaviorize us. But more and more, this rationality, algorithmic rationality, if you like, is being pushed into our everyday life, but also doubly pushed into urban life because it's in the fabric of the city, the walls, the railways, the underground, all places will carry sensors, and we are being tracked and information taken. Next, please. So this is just a representation of the smart city from a magazine, I think. Next, please. Next. Yeah, you know, they have a congress, I think, in Barcelona every year, a World Congress. And of course, 5G was a big thing, you know, the smart city with 5G. We've all got these high-powered phones and transferring masses of data backwards and forwards. And of course, it's not just transferring and receiving data, it's generating data. The city is a data generating hub. Information hub. Next, please. And of course, you know, there are lots of interesting interfaces for this. You can have a touch screen. Next, please. Or you can have maybe a sort of hologram screen in the future, something that pops up, or, you know, a few years back we had Google glasses or whatever. So you can see this second city in association, the data city in association to the city you're walking and in. You can get the full information on that one too, and know where to go, know where you can get a cup of coffee nearby. You don't have to use your eyes and look. Your phone will tell you. Yeah, next. So this is an image of Tokyo. Tokyo Tower is now pulsing with data and sending out information, and all these little receivers round about are interacting with Tokyo Tower. Next, please. And here again, another image of Tokyo, and you can see the artist has got hooked on this idea of these lines of signals shooting across the city. Next, please. So we have all these communication devices. We have all these sensors. We have all our computers and Wi-Fi nets. But how are they coordinated? Well, they're coordinated through operation centers, and often we don't know very much about operation centers. But the whole idea of operation centers comes from military, as does a lot of the computer technology. The internet comes from American military and was a piece of warfare-inspired technology. So control centers have screens for simulating data. They have dashboards that measure the performance of different parts of the city. So you can have a visualization of many aspects of the volume of the three-dimensional volume entity of the city. Next, please. This is in Seoul in Korea, and you can see this is the sort of image, lots of screens, lots of zooming in cameras. Next, please. Again, Rio de Janeiro, built in time by IBM for the 2016 Olympics. And it's interesting to know, like, a lot of this is like, you know, real time, what's happening in the city, but other ones will be visualizations of data, of traffic flows, of congestion in the city, or of other potential problems. Next, please. This, again, comes out of the military, Houston Mission Control, NASA. Not really fair to call it necessarily military. Next, please. This is definitely military. This is American Combined Operations Base in Qatar. Yeah, next, please. But underneath this, we also have something most of us never notice in the city when we walk around. We don't notice the data centers because nobody let us in. And you know, I have no idea where it is in London, yeah? And I'm pretty certain it's not in the mayor's building by Tower Bridge in London. It will be a big building somewhere. Data needs housing somewhere. And we rarely think of this. We think of a screen. We think of immaterial culture. The internet is immaterial, but it's material. Computers take up a big carbon footprint. Computers require data centers to exist. Because when we store it, we say it's storing on the cloud, but it's not on the cloud. The cloud is a metaphor for something stored in a place. Let's have a look. Next, please. So these are large buildings dotted around the city. They use massive amounts of electricity. They need to cool. They get very hot. Currently, 2% of global electric consumption is from data centers, to rise to 8% by 2030. And interesting, it has the same carbon footprint as the airline industry. So data centers take up a lot of energy, and we think of computers and working at home. Oh yeah, this is great, we're saving energy, but we're also using energy. Next please. Yeah, so this is where the data is stored. And you can get the idea. You know, you may have an external drive to your computer, but these are the big boys. This isn't a little USB storage device. These are major hardware. Next, please. Yeah, and even bigger hardware. Next, please. And if you think of these buildings, you can see the cars in the bottom left. You get a sense of the scale of this data centers. But this isn't all of them. This is just one set of data centers in one place near London. Next, please. This is the Microsoft one in London. Next, please. Equinox, next please. And this is a map of where they are in London. So quite a lot, 119 sites. Next please. And this is Tokyo. And when we talked about this a year ago, people were surprised in Tokyo. Nobody had much idea that there were data centers in Tokyo. Next please. And this is the center of Tokyo, Shinjuku, some of you will know, and Shinagawa, towards the bay, and Tokyo University, the Emperor's Palace is the sort of space without buildings in the middle. Next, surveillance city. So data centers are part of an apparatus, including the command centers and the infrastructures, Infostructures, which enables constant surveillance. Chongqing in China has allegedly 2.6 million cameras for 15 million people. And AI facial recognition technologies are now capable of scanning faces and matching them up against police databases in real time. So many cities are following this procedure. So there is a reaction, of course. San Francisco has banned use of facial recognition technology. Barcelona wants to try and get its own form of empowerment separate from the platforms, the major internet platforms, but it's a difficult struggle. Next, please. So, yeah, everything is becoming smart. You can get a smart holiday, you can live in a smart city, or you can watch the smart Olympics. Next, please. Smart holidays, you can go to Shibuya Crossing. Next, please. This is the development Google planned in Toronto, the smart city by the lakeside. Next, please. Beautiful. Next, please. Drawings of what it would be like. Nice, happy family life. Next, please. Next, please. But of course, it generated an opposition, and this is an image from the opposition to Google's plans, and eventually they defeated it. Next, please. So the smart city didn't work there. But in today's global economy, it's not just the big five data corporations, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, and Google, but we have now China joining. We have Alibaba number 6 and Huawei number 10 in the top 500. Of course, the state involvement of the Chinese companies is something we have to take on board. Next, please. This is the president of Huawei talking about smart city development in Barcelona. Next, please. And of course, the Belt and Road Initiative from China takes them into many parts of the world. And it's interesting to see Nigeria smart city deployment there. Huawei logo there, the red logo, prominent. Next, please. So Huawei now claims to be leading global provider of ICT infrastructure and smart devices. Yeah, next. And this is sort of interesting to me, the metaphoric representation of the relation of the smart city. Here we have nervous system. We have the intelligent operating center, the data center at the top, and then we have these various platforms down to street levels and users, and the nervous system. So the nervous system is bringing everything back to the brain. Yeah. Next slide, please. Next, please. So here again, this is the brain metaphor. Atop the city, we have the brain connecting to all the various devices in the city. Next, please. So we even have now the Smart Olympics. So, of course, major events like the football, World Cup and Olympic Games occur usually in global cities, or the top games are in the global cities. Cities which have smart city infrastructure and have the media connectivity and hardware to pump it out to the world. Next, please. So the Digital Olympics, the IOC now has the International Olympic Committee, IOC, has a digital technology commission and committed to innovation, especially LA 2028, and I'm sure in Paris 2024 as well. And it's interesting to note that worldwide partner is Alibaba, the Chinese company, who also run the Olympic broadcast services with a series of channels, and have Alibaba Cloud with a smarter AI data-powered Olympics using VR, virtual reality, and AR, artificial reality technology, plus capacity to tap into their archives and data and past events, etc., as you're sitting there in real time watching. Next, please. Digital Technology Commission. You can see the IOC logo there. Next. This is the 2028. Next. Next, please. Yeah. This is the Olympic channel. Yeah, the number of channels constantly providing material on the Olympic Games and Paralympics. Next, please. Yeah. Next, please. Yeah. So intelligent Olympic Games powered by data. Yeah. smarter with Alibaba Cloud, you see. Next, please. Yeah, and we have this again, the brain comes in. Cloud sports brain. Next, please. And of course, this enhanced digital experience. You can feel the events, participate in the event much better with the technology. Next, please. And of course, the technology is useful for training. Next, please. And general communications. Next, please. So this is an interesting slide here. We've got the city brain, the industry brain, brain solutions, and this metaphor, the brain, from Alibaba. Next, please. So we can see that this metaphor of the organism, that a smart city is like a living organism powered by a nervous system, with all the parts bringing back the information to the control centers through the peripheral nerve endings, the sensors embedded around the city or in your phones as you walk the city. Next, please. So Barcelona is trying to go beyond this smart city, as we mentioned, but it's a difficult route. Next, please. Next, please. Conclusion. We got there. So what can we take from this? First of all, there are a lot of city images. There's a premium for producing memorable images which are marketable. Visual images of the city abound, but they also generate anti-images, the search for immediacy, affective encounters, sensory immersion in disjunctive city life at the street level. This is the city without image, the city which is not one, this something which refuses the city with image, the ordered city. But digital technologies and the smart city sensor apparatus generate masses of data which allegedly help to better govern the cities. They facilitate the focus on the 3D volume of the city, the info city above and the cabled city below. Data is harvested from every aspect of the 3D space of the city. It means we can be known, surveilled, and recorded, and then visualized and simulated to enable all aspects of the life of the city to be governed. But these technologies enable a visualization and modeling of the city. They also have an academic potential. We can use them, and you could argue they're also useful for the citizens. They have a media literacy potential. There should be buildings available where people can go in and look at this data and see how it's used and discuss future possibilities. So the struggle is to open up the data and grant access to citizens to encourage greater public sphere involvement and participation in decision making and planning. Okay, so the last thing to say is postscript. Next one. Yeah, so you've got the smart Paris coming along, the smart Olympics in Paris. These are just a couple of things I pulled off the internet. Utopia has a piece about how it's boosting smart cities in France. So I think you're going to see a lot of smart city discourse and images over the next 2 or 3 years in the lead up. And I think you might just add even more in the sense of the anniversary of 9/11 and Afghan and the concern for security in the city and how a major profile event can become safe for the citizens, bearing in mind the Munich Olympics and the dangers and the trade-off between security and open access and openness is an interesting one to navigate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, for this presentation. It was very clear and very interesting. If I may to add something about your point about the Chinese group of data and the Chinese internet group of companies. Sorry. Yeah. So we heard that this week Alibaba was attacked by the Chinese government, and the Chinese government asked to Alibaba to give all the data they collected on the Chinese population, and evidently they will ask for the data for everybody in the world. So it's interesting to see that in the Chinese case, particularly the company are totally connected to the Chinese government, and so smart cities and smart things, I can say in general, are used to control the population. That is quite strange, not strange because it's an evidence, we understand why they do that, but it's afraid. We are afraid from your point of view about this kind of policy. So it's a very good thing to see and to understand for everybody that internet is not a neutral space, if we can say cyberspace, evidently.
Yes, I think that's very true, and I've been reading recently in the Financial Times and other places in the last week or two about the intensification of the control over companies, over entertainment companies, and the policy to control access to computer games and gaming on the internet, and to limit it for children and young adults. You may know that China has a social security system where you get points for various good things and negative points taken away for bad things. So it has this, digital surveillance apparatus of everybody in the country, and Alibaba moving towards more entertainment, general media things, also becoming an independent sort of stock market company that has a sort of global profile and its own agendas. Now a lot of that has been pulled back in by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and Xi Jinping. In a sense, we have to understand the relationship with the market and the state in China is maybe a different one. It may not be a problem for our Olympics, but it is a sense that the data is traveling not just to a data center in Paris necessarily, but it's traveling other places too.
Yes, absolutely. And if I can come back to the beginning of your presentation, I noted some question. I wanted to know, how do you think that Japanese are seeing the skyscraper now in Japan? Because Japan didn't have a real tradition of skyscraper before the Second World War, and so cities in Japan were quite in a low level, and we know that because when you go to Japan and the suburb of Tokyo particularly, you have these huge suburbs that have only house or very little building, but not very high building. So yes, this very quick and fast change in the cities in Japan. How do you think the Japanese see the skyscraper today?
I think they're ambivalent. I think there's a romantic loyalty to the traditional wood house, and one I share, built round the inner courtyard, a bit like some of the Islamic architecture or in China, and it is wonderful with a garden in the middle of the house, this type of setting. But not many people live in that house anymore. They live in blocks or suburban housing. But if you look at Tokyo, there has been a lot of high-rise. Shinjuku has a lot of high buildings, which is one of the main entertainment areas, hotels and offices. But the Bayside now has a lot of new building and a lot of sort of global capital. You know, it's where I would think the super rich maybe live, or people taking money out of China or East Asia to a safe place, buy property in Tokyo. And usually it's apartments in high-rise blocks. Some of them might be gated communities. I think there is an ambivalence. The Mori building, I don't know whether you know the Mori building with the art museum, Tokyo Art Museum, famous art museum, is relatively down towards the bay. And from that towards the bay, there's a lot of newer developments. And even where we live across the river in North Tokyo, in Saitama, there's high rise. There's on the river side. There's quite high rise. But Japanese are good engineers and have learned to live with earthquakes. But there is a big fear, of course, in Tokyo. The big one is overdue. And one scenario is that Tokyo, which sticks out into the Pacific, that area is on a fault line which would break off and go away. So they live with this this sort of ambivalence in Japan.
Yes, thank you for this answer. And do you think that we talk a lot about the Tokyo Games of 1964? I think the first skyscraper were built at the same time. So do you think that the modernity of Tokyo, and in general the modernity of global cities, are connected to the verticality and to the high rise? There is a strong link between the idea of to be a global city and to have a high rise building or a skyscraper or Eiffel Tower and Tokyo Tower in general. Is that connected so evidently?
I think so. I mean, I did some work years ago on Chicago School, and I remember looking at Robert Park and Burgess and people who were looking at Chicago, and they talked about the central business district being the area of the highest rents. So you find the place which is the center where more people traffic past, and that becomes the place with higher rents. And therefore, there's a tendency, if you have a very expensive rent place, to build up. You're maximizing your utility of the space. And I think the American cities, you know, the invention of the elevator in just after the turn of the century, I think, 20th century, it became possible for safe elevator travel within large buildings. And, Manhattan, of course, with the confined space there, you can see the imperative for high rise. And I think that, other cities follow suit. Here in London, we look across the river and we see the City of London, which has a lot of strange looking high-rise buildings, the Gherkin and the cheese grater and whatever. They get these slightly cheeky local names. And then we have Canary Wharf. And every time we go and look at it from Greenwich, we see there's one or two more towers gone up. And there seems to be a fashion for these ultra-thin towers now, which go up. So you think, well, why ultra-thin? And just now I've been thinking it out as we talk, because of the land rent. The profile on the ground, the amount of land you have to buy is limited. And if you have the technology to push one up very, very high, you're making a good, profitable use of the land. I think there was one in Manhattan recently near Central Park, which was turned down, but that was going to be a super tower, one of these super towers. And quite a lot of the Chinese cities, Chongqing being one we mentioned, has had these super towers. Now, if the city, there's a lot being written on the vertical city. Steve Graham has a book on this area, very interesting. And it depends upon lifts. But you know, if the city becomes vertical, then of course the thing we're talking about now, the surveillance apparatus becomes different. It becomes easier in one way because you can embed all the sensors within the building, so you can pre-install them in the lifts and the corridors. Everywhere can have sensors, so the information coming back is quite easy within these artificial built environments.
Yes, and this is very interesting what you say. So we understand the link between the high-rise and the accumulation of the capital. So if we come back to the David Harvey theory, we can see that it's a spatial fix. The skyscraper as a kind of spatial fix, and to accumulate more capital and to have more profitability. But if we look at the Eiffel Tower in Paris or the Tokyo Tower, these two buildings are very iconic, but at the same time they are not for profitability or for a spatial fix of capital. So do you think that we see in London that the charts have absolutely not the same utilities as the Eiffel Tower, or in New York there is no building that is high-rise without the question of the accumulation of capital? So there is a big difference between these two utilization. Do you think that we can there is difference between Tokyo, Paris in one side, and the other side, London and New York, about the iconicity of this high building, or it is the same way, but with just, yes, perhaps one strange thing to have Eiffel Tower built in the past, and finally it was just one shot, and it never come back to build iconic building without the idea to accumulate capital?
Yeah, just a few quick thoughts on this. I need to think more. But if we think of the Eiffel Tower, this was built, I think, for one of the great exhibitions. Yeah. Yes. So the land around it was kept low-rise for that exhibition. Of course, you know, we had the 1851 one in London, in Hyde Park, which was moved to Crystal Palace in the south, not very far from where we live, in near Goldsmiths. So you can see that they were in a good setting, or the Eiffel Tower was in a good setting, which made for iconicity. You know, if they'd been surrounded by skyscrapers, you know, dwarfed, this would be, you know, it couldn't work as an icon. And I'm sure there are very strong laws, building regulations, not allowing this to happen. But the iconicity, as you say, it becomes something almost priceless. You know, it's like you cannot value the Eiffel Tower in its capacity to draw in tourists and represent a positive image of Paris. So there is a sort of it goes beyond normal modes of calculating value, I think. And I'm trying to think of what is the equivalent in London, and it's quite difficult. Maybe I can think of Tower Bridge, you know, but that's not that old. That's just Victorian. Or I can think of Big Ben, also Victorian. Buckingham Palace, these type of things, or the Palace of Westminster, the Parliament building. But the heritage is a very important trade-off, the heritage tourism. And I think of the book, you know, by Boltanski and Esquer, which came out a year or two ago, Enrichment, I think, I don't know the French title correctly, which looks at how France, you know, which France sees itself as the home of high culture, of arts and serious culture, that France has been able to use this through culture industries, relatively small scale culture industries, to exploit the culture. There's a continual process. But just to come back a little bit on smart city, I didn't mention, but there is a movement for dumb cities. It's a bit of a joke one, yeah. The American notion of dumb, yeah.
Yeah.
The city that doesn't speak, but the city that looks something, and it's really a sort of ecology forestation of the city, of plants on balconies, of things in the street, and very apt in terms of the Paris climate change conference and global heating, Anthropocene, and all the worries we have. So there is a sense, don't go smart, go a step backwards, dumb, green, eco city as well. And if you can do this without disturbing the land values too much, or by increasing the land values, or decreasing pollution, which of course these plants do, then it may be factored into these calculations of city value and city health.
Thank you for this answer. Perhaps we can, if someone have a question in the audience. So if there is no question, perhaps do you want to add something to conclude, or
yeah, I mean,
yes.
I think the thing we talked about security is a big one, and I just I was watching documentaries recently on 9/11, and you read a lot in the press about how the world changed a lot after 9/11, and now Afghanistan, and I think there is a big security operation going to take place. Now, on one level, this is okay for TV audience, for the media games or the social media games, a bit like the Tokyo one we've just watched. But if you want the festive city, the carnival city, yeah, and the dressing up, and this is part of the atmosphere of the Olympics. It's Bakhtin. Bakhtin talks about the carnivalesque, the sort of the playfulness, and people having a good time and performing. The marathon runners go past a lot of people applauding, but also some of these people are playful. They're watching big screens in the center of the city. They're having a good time. So this type of image of the festive city for the 2 or 3 weeks of the games, I think is a very important aspect. And, Paris, I'm sure, wants to involve the city. It wants to involve the banlieue. It wants to involve the people in the peripheries to bring them in, and that they will, have a good time. So it's a sort of celebratory thing. So it doesn't want to be cameras looking, police looking, army looking at everybody walking past. Is this guy a terrorist? So I think there's a very difficult trough at the moment. Of course, things may get better. The Taliban, may come on board some form of global order, and you don't know. But from today's perspective, this is one of the worries we have about the Paris Games.
Absolutely, I'm sure it will be one of the most important point for the French government, and we will see how they manage to prepare the game and to do the event with this many uncertainty we have about the future, and not only about security, but for the pandemic too. It will be interesting to see if Paris have a good answer or not for the game. So thank you, Mike, to be here today, and thank you everybody. We will have a next session of the webinar, the 12th of October, with two professors from the University of Strasbourg, and we will talk about the contestation of the bids for the games in European cities, and particularly in the case of Rome, Budapest, and Hamburg for 2024. So thank you for everything, and have a good day.
Yeah, thank you a lot, and enjoyed being able to virtually present, and hope we meet and people can email me if they want to follow up. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, and have a good day, and see you for the next webinar. And the webinar was recorded evidently, and we will put the video in the website. So thank you, everybody, and have a good day.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.